This is our final class on America, what the founders believed and what we believe. Let's again start off by reviewing what we've covered so far. First, we looked at the historical events that marked the founding of our nation. Events which include the voyages of Columbus at the end of the 1400s, the settlement of Jamestown in 1607, the settlement of Plymouth in 1620, and the American Revolution in the late 1700s. And in each of those key events, we saw an emphasis on spreading the Christian faith. In his own words, Columbus believed God's Spirit was with him. In the official charter, Jamestown was founded to propagate the Christian religion. In the Mayflower Compact, Plymouth was founded for the advancement of the Christian faith. And in the founders' own words, the Revolutionary War was to secure the God-given right of liberty. We then turned our attention last time to look more closely at what the founders themselves said. And first, we showed that there is very, very little evidence that more than just one or two of our founders were deists. Instead, there is an almost endless amount of evidence our founders professed publicly to be Christians. There's also physical evidence everywhere in our capital for our Christian heritage, and we looked at a lot of what's been left behind. We then went one by one and heard from the most influential founders of our country, and they all had something to say about the importance of Christianity, of the Bible, and the morals of the triune God. So today, we're going to look at the historical manuscripts and official documents that emerged from the time of our nation's founding and see what they tell us. And our focus, of course, will be the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Those are the official documents that more than any other have shaped our country. But first, let me share this. In 1988, two University of Houston researchers published a book that was the result of a 10-year study on who the founders referenced the most in their writings. They looked at over 15,000 political writings from the years 1760 to 1805, and they discovered 3,154 direct quotes. And here's what they found. 7.9% of those quotes are from William Blackstone. He was an English judge from the 1700s who wrote extensive commentaries on the laws of England. I mean, his commentaries literally became the final word in the U.S. Supreme Court. And he was a strong Christian. He said this, "The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws." In fact, the great evangelist Charles Finney, you may have heard of him, said that when he was a lawyer, he read and studied Blackstone's commentaries regularly. And because he read so much scripture in them, it led him to become a Christian. Finney would then go on to lead the great spiritual revival in America in the early 1800s. In second place, at 8.3%, the founders quoted Montesquieu. He was a French political philosopher from the early 1700s who developed and promoted the idea of a separation of powers in government, which makes sense since the separation of powers was extremely important to our founders. They wanted to stay far away from tyranny. Here's what he said. "The Christian religion, which orders men to love one another, no doubt wants the best political laws and best civil laws for each people, because those laws are, after religion, the greatest good that men can give and receive." Montesquieu understood the inherently selfish and prideful nature of man, and that if given the opportunity, one would accumulate as much power as possible and become a tyrant. That's why he believed so strongly in the separation of powers in government. And then coming in first place, at 34%, the Bible. Over a third of all direct quotes from the founders between 1760 and 1805 were direct quotes from the Bible. No other source was referenced or cited more, and it's not even close. So when it comes to our founding era, this should be a big indicator of what the founders were studying and what they wanted to shape their thinking when they laid out the framework of our nation's government. And it was the Bible. All right, well, now let's look more closely at these official manuscripts: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence was put together from June to July of 1776 and was made official on July 4th. That's when it was officially declared that the 13 colonies were breaking off from Great Britain and forming their own union. And when you look at the Declaration of Independence, there are 4 direct references to God: the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Second, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Then there's a list of 27 grievances against the King of Great Britain, which is why they're declaring independence. Then you have a third, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. And fourth, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So here you can see that this one-page document, in this one-page document, God is referenced 4 separate times. And it reveals several things that the founders believed. Number 1, they believed that God placed laws in nature so that they are unmistakable and clear to everyone. And one natural law is that all people are entitled to freedom, that we should all have this equal station in life. Number 2, they believe that all people are divinely created by God and created with equal value in His eyes, and that everyone should have the liberty to pursue happiness in life. Number 3, they believe that we are all accountable to God as our judge, that we will answer to Him in the end, and that He knows both our actions and the intentions of our heart. And they believed that we need protection from God, that He has the power through providence to bless and give success to any particular people He chooses, or to allow calamity to come upon them. Those are 4 powerful beliefs in God, set out clearly in the Declaration of Independence. Not only that, but if you look just a little closer, there's something even more fascinating that stands out. It says, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That's the legislative branch. Appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. There you have the judicial branch. With the firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. There you have the executive branch. And that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator. That's a reference to the founder, the one founder of human life. God is the only one who should ever rule with absolute power. Because you can see what happens when humans take that position. I mean, there's a list of 27 grievances or complaints given in the Declaration of Independence of how the King of Great Britain was abusing his powers. He made the laws, he controlled the military, and he was the final judge. And as a result, he violated human rights, he mistreated the colonists, and he became a tyrant. And that's why Americans wanted independence. God is the only one who can be trusted with all 3 roles, which you can see in the Declaration. But when it comes to human government, these branches of powers must be separated. All right, now let's take a look at the Constitution. The Constitution was drafted from May to September of 1787, and then it was signed on September 17th of that year. Unlike the Declaration of Independence, there aren't as many direct references to God in the Constitution, which is surprising. I mean, with so many quotes from our founders revealing what they believed, you would think that those beliefs would have been more explicit and clear in the Constitution. But they're not. And it's just a reminder that the Constitution, in the end, it's not perfect. It was made by humans. Even though our Constitution is a great historical document, it's still a human document. At the same time, though, if you look closely, the Constitution does make reference to God and to a number of biblical beliefs. Number 1, it says, in the year of our Lord. So this acknowledges the birth and the life of Jesus Christ and that He is Lord. Number 2, any bill not returned by the president within 10 days, Sundays excepted, and it goes on to say, shall be law. And this obviously acknowledges Sunday to be a day of rest and a day of worship. Number 3, the senators, representatives, members of the state legislators, all executives and judicial officers shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. It says the same thing about the president. It says, before he, the president, enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Oliver Wolcott said, the Constitution enjoins an oath upon all the officers of the United States. I mean, this is a direct appeal to that God who is the avenger of perjury. Such an appeal to him is full acknowledgement of his being and providence. John Witherspoon also said, an oath is an appeal to God, the searcher of hearts, for the truth of what we say, and always expresses or supposes an imprecation or a calling down of his judgment upon us if we prevaricate or lie. An oath, therefore, implies a belief in God and his providence, and indeed is an act of worship. And what most likely started with our first president, George Washington, has continued ever since. Almost every president has taken their oath with a hand on the Bible and adding to the end of the oath the words, "So help me God." Not only that, but we can also see God in our Constitution when we look closely at our present form of government and the way that our government is structured. I mean, our form of government, we know that we are a republic, and it's even required of each state to be so. It says in the Constitution that each state is required to maintain a republican form of government. And this follows the pattern that God set out for the Israelites. In Exodus 18:21, you see it says, moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And then in Deuteronomy 16:18, it says, you shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes. And they shall judge the people with a righteous judgment. You can also see the three branches of government. In Isaiah 33:22, it says, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us. So in just that verse, you have God as judge, the judicial branch, lawgiver, legislative branch, and king, executive branch. You can also see that the founders understood the need for a separation of powers. As it says in Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So no one branch or office should hold too much power, because human nature is corrupted by sin and power corrupts even more. Like Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. For example, the King of Great Britain. And this is why James Madison suggested a long list of checks and balances to keep any one person or body from gaining too much power. He said, the governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself by the use of checks and balances. Then we also see the example for tax exemptions for churches. In Ezra 7:24, it says, we also notify you that it shall not be lawful to impose tribute, custom, or toll on any one of the priests, Levites, the singers, doorkeepers, the temple servants, or other servants of this house of God. I mean, these are the people whose life is devoted to serving God and to serving his people, and to add the burden of taxation would only limit the good that they are able to do. So this has been the thinking as well behind America's tax exemption for churches. You also see America's free market system reflected in Scripture. Number one, it talks about a responsibility to provide for your family in 1 Timothy 5:8. It talks about there's a command to work in order to eat in 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Also, you see the example of working for an established pay in Matthew 20, verse 4. So the direct references to God may not be many in the Constitution, but the evidences that the Bible guided the founders' thinking when drafting the Constitution are many. All right, well, now let's look at the Bill of Rights, which is a major section of the Constitution today that actually was lacking at the start. This is, again, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. There was a lot of debate when they were drafting the Constitution whether or not to include a list of rights. Many people felt strongly that the Constitution did not need a Bill of Rights because the people and the states had every right that wasn't specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution. Therefore, it was obvious, and it would just be redundant. Not only that, but if you make a list of specific rights that people always have, it might be taken by some to mean that everything not in the Bill of Rights is not a right. And then that opens the door to the government just stripping away people's freedom. At the same time, there are many others on the other side who felt very strongly that it was absolutely necessary to protect and to put in stone our basic human rights, our most basic human rights. If these rights aren't mentioned and absolutely guaranteed, it's as if they don't exist. And governments cannot be trusted. Tyranny is inevitable. And so what happened was, in a compromise, it was agreed that when drafting and ratifying the Constitution itself in 1787, it would not include this list of rights. But Congress would immediately take up a discussion about what basic rights should be added to the Constitution once it was ratified. And that discussion began 2 years later, and those first 10 rights, known as the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791. And the very first right, or First Amendment, that everyone agreed on, the freedom of religion, the right to worship God freely and openly and to live according to your beliefs without interference at all from the government. The First Amendment starts out like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is, the government has no power to make laws establishing a certain set of religious beliefs or to prevent people from living according to their beliefs. This amendment restricts the government, not the people, which is great, and it's how it should be. And for over 2 centuries, that's how it was understood and how it was followed. In fact, it's interesting what you discover when you look at the congressional records from the time of the First Amendment. In the congressional records from June 8th to September 25th, 1789, the records show that the founders over and over again were discussing the importance of avoiding what happened under the rule of Great Britain. They wanted a national government that did not legally establish one religious denomination over all others. Yes, it was more about church denominations than anything else, whether it was Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, whatever. The words religion and denomination were used interchangeably in their discussions. That's what the records show. They were concerned that one Christian denomination would never be established as America's national church. In fact, the original version of the First Amendment, which was introduced on September 3rd, 1789, stated this. It said, Congress shall not make any law establishing any religious denomination. A second version said, Congress shall make no law establishing any particular denomination. Third version said, Congress shall make no law establishing any particular denomination in preference to any other. And the final version is what we have today. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So religion and denomination were used interchangeably. It had nothing to do at all with how it's being applied today. The First Amendment doesn't say anything about restricting citizens, private organizations, or even government officials from expressing or acting on their own personal religious beliefs. Both clauses of the freedom of religion restrict and limit the government. It limits Congress, no one else. This is even backed by a Supreme Court decision in 1799, Runkle versus Weinmiller, where they said, by our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion, and all sects and denominations of Christians are placed upon the same equal footing. I mean, that's 1799. That's barely 10 years after the First Amendment was drafted. Also notice The First Amendment doesn't say anything at all about a separation between church and state. Nowhere. That phrase is not a part of the First Amendment, or any amendment, or any part of the Constitution. Might be surprising, because we always hear that phrase, but it's nowhere in our Constitution. All right, so where does it come from? Well, it comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of pastors years later. In fact, Jefferson had nothing to do with drafting the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. He wasn't even in the country at the time. He was in France. But 10 years later, on October 7th, 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut sent a letter to Thomas Jefferson, who was at that time president, because they were concerned that the freedom of religion was included in the Bill of Rights. And to them, it was almost like saying, the government gives you the right to worship God. And they thought, well, if the government can give you that right, then some will say that the government can take it away as well. And Jefferson understood their concern, and he completely agreed with the view that the freedom of religion was a God-given right, not one granted by the government. And this is what Jefferson replied to the pastors. He said, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. In other words, I understand. I agree. But don't worry, pastors. It says clearly that Congress can't make any law regarding religion to enforce it or prohibit it. That means there's a huge wall blocking the government from doing anything when it comes to religion. The wall keeps government out. So Jefferson was reassuring the pastors that the First Amendment permanently keeps Congress from doing anything to restrict their freedom to worship God as they please. Jefferson knew exactly what the First Amendment meant, that no particular church denomination would be established by Congress. And this is even more clear by another letter that Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Rush on September 23rd, 1800. He said, clergy have a very favorite hope of obtaining an establishment of a particular form or denomination of Christianity through the U.S. And as every sect believes its own form the true one, everyone perhaps hoped for its own, especially the Episcopalians and Congregationalists. They believe that any position of power confided to me will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe truly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. So in other words, good luck if you're going to try and push your particular denomination to be established politically while I'm in office. It's not going to happen. It's prohibited by the First Amendment, and I've sworn to uphold the Constitution, and I will. So the Constitution is clear, Jefferson's views are clear, and it's very clear that what Jefferson meant when he said the separation of church and state. Unfortunately, though, the phrase separation of church and state has been hijacked, and now it's being used to keep religion out of everything, so that you can only express your religious beliefs how and when the government says you can. In fact, look at the rest of the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So included in the First Amendment are the rights to openly talk about your religious beliefs, freedom of speech, the right to publish literature on your religious beliefs, freedom of the press, and the right to worship God together according to those religious beliefs, freedom of assembly. All right, well, those are our founding documents, the official manuscripts, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Now, quickly, let's take a look at two written statements commonly used to argue against the Christian character of our founding. The first one is, it's in the Constitution itself, where we find the Three-Fifths Clause, or the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is right at the very beginning of the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 2, and it says this: representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. It's that last part, 3/5 of all other persons. This clause is used today to say that the founders considered blacks as having only 3/5 the human value of a white person, which is completely wrong and completely misrepresents the intent of this clause. Remember, slavery was popular in the South, and so many of the states from the South wanted to count all their slaves as full citizens because it would increase their representation in Congress. They knew that the more citizens you have in your state, the more representatives you can seat in Congress. But the northern states knew that if the South gained more seats in Congress, they would only use those seats to increase their political power and then push their pro-slavery agenda even more, which they opposed. On the other hand, those who were anti-slavery, those who were abolitionists, they wanted to limit the number of representatives from the pro-slavery states by introducing the 3/5 clause. Plus, it would encourage slave owners to set their slaves free. That way they would immediately have a higher representation in Congress if they had more free citizens. So the 3/5 clause was actually very anti-slavery. It was an effort to limit the power of pro-slavery states who were not giving full citizenship to their slaves, but still wanted them to be counted as such. It had nothing at all to do with diminishing the value of black Americans. Rather, it was an effort toward the opposite. Here's what Luther Martin said. Not Martin Luther, but Luther Martin. He was a founding father. He said, "The continuance of the slave trade, and thus giving it a national sanction and encouragement, ought to be considered as justly exposing us to the displeasure and vengeance of him who is equally Lord of all, and who views with equal eye the poor African slave and his American master. Some today misinterpret the constitutional provision of counting the slaves as 3/5 for purposes of representation as pro-slavery or black dehumanization. But it was a political compromise between the North and the South. The 3/5 provision applied only to slaves and not free blacks who voted and had the same rights as whites. And in some southern states, this meant being able to own slaves. While the southern states wanted to count the slaves in their population to determine the number of congressmen from their states, slavery opponents pushed to keep the southern states from having more representatives and hence more power in Congress. So very clearly, the 3/5 clause was an anti-slavery effort that very much did value the lives of all people, including slaves. All right, number 2, the other written statement that is used against the idea that the founders were Christians is the Treaty of Tripoli, signed in 1797. On June 10th, 1797, here's what it says in this treaty. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and that's the part, but keep reading. As it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. In other words, the United States of America is not founded with a purpose to conquer nations who follow other religions and force everyone to become Christians. Christianity is a personal religion, not a national one. That's what this is saying. You have to understand the religion of Islam to understand this treaty. For Muslims who closely read and follow the Quran, Islam, Sharia law, and jihad are intricately connected. That's how Islam was spread initially, through military conquest and military force. But that's not America. That's not our history. That's not Christianity. America had no interest to declare war or act with hostility against Tripoli, which is today Libya, simply because the people there were Muslim. But, of course, this one statement taken way out of context is used by some today to say Christianity had no part in our founding. And conveniently, they also ignore what happened and took place in 1805, 8 years later, when the U.S. and Tripoli signed a new treaty, and that phrase is gone. And it says, instead, the government of the USA has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Muslims. Basically, it's saying the exact same thing, just in different words. Christianity is a part of our founding. It's just the government of America has no enmity against Muslim nations. So if people are really going to be honest, then they should look at the wording of this treaty just a few years later. Or they should look as well at the treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain in 1783, called the Treaty of Paris. It starts out by saying, in very big letters at the top of the treaty, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Only Christians believe in a Trinitarian view of God, so it can only be referring to a Christian view of God. Finally, let's look at some official Supreme Court rulings that make it clear that America was founded on Christian principles. The Supreme Court case People v. Ruggles in 1811, this case dealt with a man who went on a planned profanity tirade and attacked the person of Jesus Christ. And this is what they concluded. The people of this state, New York, in common with the people of this country, profess the general doctrines of Christianity as the rule of their faith and practice. And to scandalize the author of these doctrines is not only, in a religious point of view, extremely impious, but even in respect to the obligations due to society, is a gross violation of decency and good order. The Supreme Court ruled that whoever attacks Jesus Christ attacked Christianity, which is a direct attack on the foundation of the country and the country itself. The man was sentenced to 3 months in jail and a fine of $500. Again, this was 1811, when people were still alive to know for sure what the First Amendment said and what it meant. Supreme Court case Vidal versus Girard in 1844. This was a case that included considering whether a school can make a rule to not allow Christian teachers. And they said this: where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? Where are benevolence, the love of truth, sobriety, and industry so powerfully and irresistibly inculcated as in the sacred volume? The Supreme Court ruled that Christianity and the Bible should be the source of teaching morality in schools. And then you look at the Supreme Court case Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States in 1892. They said this: no purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation. The Supreme Court provided 87 precedents in this case. 87 precedents from the previous 100 years. This case was meant to be referred to again and again in the coming years by the Supreme Court so that their rulings would always be consistent. The 87 precedents include quoting the Founding Fathers, quoting the acts of the Founding Fathers, quoting the acts of Congress, quoting the acts of state governments, and on and on. It makes a very strong case that our nation was founded on Christian principles. So when it comes to the official founding documents of the United States, there is a lot of evidence, convincing evidence, that Christian beliefs played an important role. It was the reason behind declaring our independence. It was a basis for the structure of our government. It laid the principles for many of the laws of our country, and it was a source for safeguarding our freedom of religion. And because of it, this nation has enjoyed prosperity and freedom for a very long time. The oldest existing constitution in the world is the United States Constitution. Most constitutions don't even last 20 years. Ours is now over 230 years old. But as we mentioned, our Constitution, it's not perfect. It has its flaws. And that's why we shouldn't hold our Constitution up as the standard of truth. It's not. It's the law of the land, but it's definitely not the law of our lives. As Christians, we answer to the Bible before anything else. It's the document that we should hold up highest and should be referencing and memorizing and quoting more than any other. When there's a question about how we should act, our first response should never be, what does the Constitution say I should do as an American? But rather, what does the Bible say that I should do as a follower of Christ? So in the end, after looking at the historical events, the key founders, and the official manuscripts, if there's anything that we walk away with regarding the history of America and what the founders believed, I think the most important point to remember is this, that our founding fathers believed very strongly in encouraging the citizens of America to read and follow the Bible, because a moral people would govern themselves. And that meant government could be kept small and the people could remain free. Benjamin Rush in 1789 said, the only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue. And without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object and life of all republican governments. The religion I mean to recommend in this place is that of the New Testament. John Adams said, religion and morality alone can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration, said, without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They therefore who are decrying the Christian religion are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of a free government. Noah Webster, revolutionary soldier, legislator, judge, said all the miseries and evils which men suffer from vice, crime, ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war proceed from their despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible. And Robert Winthrop, Speaker of the House of Representatives in the 1840s, said, men, in a word, must necessarily be controlled, either by a power within them or a power without them, either by the word of God or by the strong arm of man, either by the Bible or by the bayonet. And George Washington said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indisputable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. So when you take a comprehensive look at our nation's founding, including the historical events, key founders, and official manuscripts, one thing is very clear: Christianity was very important.